Hi, my name is Professor Smith. I'm a faculty member in the SCSU History Department, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of a series of brief teach-in-style lectures in which historians in our department will offer over the coming weeks in the summer of 2020 some historical perspective coming from their own expertise or interests, and bringing that perspective to bear on issues that American society is facing in the summer of 2020, particularly issues of politics, race and racism, and the pandemic, perhaps even the ways in which some of those or all of those intersect together in one moment, in order to give us a better understanding of the way that historians work and see ourselves and our craft in this time, in order to give a better sense of how we got to these moments. To help us interpret what they mean in a very confusing, troubling, traumatic, and anxiety-provoking time. And perhaps to offer some broad prescription for how we move forward armed with a better historical consciousness of how we got here. So I'd like to welcome you again. I hope that you find these interesting and useful. I hope you come back every Monday for a different view from a different historian in our department, particularly as so many of us are out of the classroom right now and really wanting to be in the classroom so that we can do the work of talking through these issues in ways that are useful and positive, or at least move the discussion, if not other areas in positive directions. So I'm going to begin this series by talking a little bit about, of all things, white womanhood and encounters with black men, and some of the historical roots and the problematical historical roots of those encounters. Now, I say this not as a scholar of these issues, and I say this with an acute sense of myself as a white male, and some of the problems inherent in lecturing anybody on these issues of white privilege, of gender. But nevertheless, I'm going to do it anyway, with some hesitancy and with some critical suspicion, and with some acknowledgement of my own shortcomings, but also armed with the sense that this is an important conversation to have, and I think that I can bring some historical light to it that's useful, and with the understanding that if we were in the classroom, this would be something that I would be discussing, however clumsily. So, as many of you are by now aware, on Memorial Day, just a few weeks ago, just a few hours before George Floyd was brutally killed in Minneapolis, a different kind of racial and racist encounter was playing out in New York City's Central Park, and that was between a white female dog walker named Amy Cooper and a black birder named Christian Cooper, who met in a forested, secluded area of Central Park. Mr. Cooper advised Ms. Cooper of the rule of putting a dog on a leash, particularly as he was looking for birds, and that escalated into an aggressive response from Ms. Cooper, filming by Mr. Cooper, and ultimately led to Ms. Cooper calling the police, threatening and then ultimately calling the police, and claiming that an African American man was attacking her. Now, when she did this, as a historian, I immediately think that she is tapping in to a much longer, darker, more insidious history. One in which everyday encounters, as problematic as they are, such as this one, come to the fore now, are more prevalent now because of cell phone cameras and of social media. But where these encounters range from the mundane, if problematic and terrible, to actually devastation and death, if we move then to other well-known cases of white men and women leveling accusations against black men, in particular, and African Americans more generally. And of course, Cooper's case is one of any number of high-profile cases lately. In 2018, there was the case of Allison Edel in San Francisco, a white woman who called the police on an 8-year-old girl, happened to be African American, or not happened, but was African American, who was selling water, as Edel claimed, without a permit. called the police on her just a few weeks earlier in Oakland. Jennifer Schulte, another white woman, calling the police on black men at a barbecue because they were using a charcoal grill, and charcoal grills were not allowed in the park. So this is far from an isolated incident, and we're seeing this more and more. Of course, it's not just happening in this moment, but it's happened countless times and often has gone unremarked. And often, of course, in an era before cell phones, it was a matter of he said versus she said. Of course, I don't want to suggest that this is only white women wielding their power and authority and their white privilege in these ways, although I want to focus on that in this particular context. It is a problem of a broader white culture of white privilege in which men are also acutely using or crudely using these sorts of tropes and narratives for all sorts of political, economic, cultural purposes. So there was the case, I'll just give you one example, of the former governor of Maine, Paul LePage, talking about drug dealing in Maine, people coming from out of state. These are guys, he said, with the name D-Money, Smoothie, Shifty, these types of guys. What does that mean? They come from Connecticut and New York. They come up here. They sell their heroin. They go back home. And then he adds, incidentally, half the time they impregnate a young white girl before they leave. Is that an actual data point? Is that an actual statistic? LePage is not just making that claim off the cuff. When he mentions that, he's tapping into a really powerful, profound set of stories that are deeply ingrained in American culture and American history, and that often have particularly devastating and discriminatory outcomes for African Americans more generally and for black men in particular. So, I think before we move on to a brief history of this, I just want to talk a little bit about whiteness, a concept that's been very much in the political, cultural discourse lately, perhaps in some corners of things, academia and other places. It's been a concept that's been around for quite a while, but we're hearing a lot about it, and I think it's useful to think about what that means for how we talk about this particular case and its history. So for this, I want to invoke the sociologist Ruth Frankenberg, who wrote an influential book about this in 1993. She says, whiteness has a set of linked dimensions, that there are these number of things going on at the same time that inform the things that white people say, the things that white people do, particularly relative to black Americans. First, whiteness is a location of structural advantage, economic, political, cultural advantage, of race privilege. That is defined, right, by class, by race, by politics, these things that are deeply ingrained in the structures of our society. Second, she says, it is a standpoint, a place from which white people look out at ourselves, of course, Frankenberg, a white woman herself, at others, and at society, right? And so we need to grapple with something more complex than being just racist or not, right? That as white people, we have certain preconceptions and understandings and assumptions, no matter our facility with racism, just by virtue of our identity as white people. So it's a standpoint, she says, a place from which white people look at ourselves, at others, and at society. Third, whiteness refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed, that often these understandings, these spoken words, these encounters, they go without being identified, without being named. And I think one of the hopeful things is that these encounters, however mundane, if problematic, or however devastating, are now going marked and now going named as such. And I think implicit in that is some prescription for how we might move forward. So let's talk a little bit about some of the salient history here. I think I'll just start broadly in saying that the framing of white womanhood and the ways in which white womanhood has historically been threatened by others transcends just black men, although I want to focus on black men as particular and unique and most useful in thinking about this current moment. But nevertheless, I think if we took a step back and just looked at the ways in which white women's vulnerabilities relative to others have been framed, we would see that this trope has been marshaled many times in the past, and not just with black men as the antagonists or the oppressors or the evildoers in this case. If we can look at the painting, the famous painting by John Vanderlyn, The Death of Jane McCrae, we see a white woman, being held prostrate, about to be scalped by two Native Americans. We see at the later on in the century, the end of the 19th century, the threat of the so-called Yellow Peril, Japanese and Chinese immigrants in particular, and the threat that they apparently posed to white women, particularly as immigration numbers on the West Coast increased in the late 19th century. And you can see there at the turn of the 20th century, during the era of World War I, the ways in which German soldiers and German culture in particular could be weaponized, brutalized in ways that invoked a certain impassioned response from young white men in American society to enlist in the military or to buy war bonds or whatever the case might be, by virtue largely of the fact that what was at stake here was the virtue, the protection of a certain kind of white womanhood that stands in for a larger set of ideas about American civilization, right? So this is something that transcends just a black other in a white-dominated society, and of course, most recently, the infamous line from President Trump as he was campaigning in 2016, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people, Trump says, and of course goes on to be elected president of the United States. So we can see that this is not something that's just confined to black men, but to Mexican and other Latin Americans, Chinese, Japanese, Native Americans, others, even Europeans. Nevertheless, I think there's something particular about the threat of black men that has to do with the centrality of African Americans in American history and American society, and of course the centrality of slavery in American society. That is particular to the black experience and the encounter between white people and black people, white women and black men in particular. And it was one that goes back to the very beginning of colonial slavery in the English colonies of North America, and one that over time largely framed black men as transgressive, as violent, as unlawful and chaotic, as brutal, as hypersexualized, as people who were out to attack and victimize white women. So this idea that Winthrop Jordan talks about, the historian Winthrop Jordan, of white women as literally the repositories of white civilization in need of protection, that was the view that many white men in the colonial era into the early 19th century, it's the way they framed this. White men tended to place these white women protectively on a pedestal, even as they went off to gratify their own passions elsewhere, and in many cases, as you can see there in the image on the top left, in raping African American slaves themselves, or enslaved African American women themselves. Black men and women were still considered sexually promiscuous in a way that endangered white women. This was the view certainly in the early 19th century, and one that discriminated against African Americans, many of them enslaved in particular, who bore the brunt of these punishments for rape and other crimes. Many of them enslaved in the early 19th century, and a system that also did not hold white men accountable and did not privilege the views and accusations of black women, many of whom were talking about advances, assaults, and rapes at the hands of white men. So this was a system in which black men were particularly victimized. It was one of a two-tiered system of legal justice, or injustice in this case, in which black men have to basically are punished with their lives for many of these infractions, including rape, at the very extreme ends of this system and of these practices, and one in which white men serve a penalty of 7 to 2 years, and having taken out the hard labor requirement in many of these states for punishment for white men who are convicted of the same crime. Let's move into the mid-19th century and into the early 20th century. The Civil War and emancipation, the ending of slavery, is really an important watershed moment here, and it's important for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, as a consequence of the Civil War, slavery ends, right? And with it ends the formalized structure of white authority that had been codified in the slave system. With it comes the Reconstruction Amendments, and particularly the 14th Amendment, which supposedly and for a time, or only half enforced or not enforced at all, for a time guarantees, or at least is in nominally guarantees, equality before the law, no matter race. Of course, much of these reforms, including the Reconstruction Amendments, get lost in Southern redemption and the turning over of so many Southern state governments and local governments to white supremacy. And in response, we see the continuation of a legal system, particularly in Southern states, but also throughout the country, that disproportionately convicts and punishes in a discriminatory way African American men for a number of crimes, including rape and others. But we also see in this era after 1865 a rise in the extra-legal process by which Southerners in particular take the law into their own hands, often on just the hint of an accusation, a shred of evidence, and perhaps none in many cases, of a white woman accusing a black man of rape or of some sort of advance that betrays the racial hierarchy in the South and of the country as a whole, to some degree for sure. And so, of course, I'm talking about lynching, depicted in any number of forms, including in, as you see there, that scene of Gus the plantation hand being caught by the Klan in the infamous 1915 movie Birth of a Nation. And lastly, I would say in this era, we have a fully emerged and developed sense of a rape myth in the United States that holds that black men were apparently monsters, hypersexualized monsters, and that any accusation of white women towards them would be followed by swift punishment. Usually resulting in death. Now, there are a number of caveats to this rape myth. Historians have been going back and looking at the proceedings of a lot of these trials, particularly in southern states, and finding that in not in all cases, or in fact not in a large number of cases, in fact, a surprisingly large number of cases, the death penalty for these sorts of crimes, including rape, is not handed down. And so, in fact, what these historians are finding is that a lot of times divisions within white society based on class and on gender differences factor into these decisions in ways that we hadn't really thought about much before, and looking at these as purely race-based and racist. And so, for example, a poor white woman in the South who has a questionable moral background as perceived at the time would be really criticized and scrutinized on the basis of class and the privilege of elite whiteness versus a sort of working class or poor whiteness. So there are interesting caveats to this as we go along. Okay, I need to move quickly because this is supposed to be a short lecture. This is what happens in my classroom too. In moving into the 20th century, these sorts of notions of the threat of African American men and the fragility of white women rear their heads in really ugly ways, which suggest the continuation of some of these stories into the 20th century and into the present, but also suggest ways in which reform begins to happen, not fully and not with the outcome of full equality before the law or in American culture, but that stirred change. And so I want to talk about a few of those. In particular, the a number of Supreme Court cases that emerged from the trials of the Scottsboro boys, 9 African-American young men who were accused by 2 women of rape on a freight train in Alabama in 1931. The Supreme Court ultimately finding that many of these men were should be found innocent, and really raising the question of the problems of an all-white jury in these cases. Then, of course, there's the case in 1955 of Emmett Till, again accused by Carolyn Bryant. You see her there on the upper left image, of making advances as a young man who was fatherless. His father was put to death in Italy, had served as a soldier in the American Army, and was himself accused of rape by 2 Italian women and was killed. So Till, a young man who is fatherless, was himself the victim of a claim of a white woman like Carolyn Bryant, a claim that she much later, and of course after the fact of Till's death, recanted quite recently. And Till suffered with his life for that false accusation, and of course it's his brutalized, disfigured body in the casket that really raises critical awareness of the ways in which this system and these stories are affecting Black people and the Black community, and really galvanizes the civil rights movement in a lot of ways, just in shock and outrage over this sort of activity. Nevertheless, of course, that leads to some change and spurs the civil rights movement. But the pervasiveness of this trope of the dangerous African-American man continues. Yet we see this in 1988 being weaponized politically in the campaign of George H.W. Bush in his run for president, using the famous Willie Horton ad. You see an image of that in the bottom left. Horton was a Black man who was convicted of murder and was on an experimental program in the state of Massachusetts being set free for a short amount of time, and using the threat, the idea that criminals and rapists would be allowed to mingle among us, that being used against the Massachusetts governor who was running against Bush in that campaign, and used to devastating political effect. Of course, Bush won that campaign, and certainly the Willie Horton ad had quite a bit to do with that. And then, of course, a year later, in '89, there's the case of the Central Park Five. Five young African-American men, 4 African-American men and 1 Latino, I believe, who were wrongly accused of raping and brutally killing a white jogger in Central Park, and just how that stirred up the same rhetoric. And we see that in places like Donald Trump's front page ads taken out in some of the New York newspapers after the Central Park Five murder, or accused murder, claiming that the death penalty for rape should be reinstituted. It had been abolished in 1972. Bring back the death penalty, Trump says. We need law and order. We need to give our police power. That was in '89, and here we are in 2020, hearing some of the same things over again. So it's time for me to wrap this up. I've spoken too long already, but where does this leave us? This leaves us back with the case of Ms. Cooper and others, like the woman who accused the young girl of selling water without a permit, apologizing because their careers have been ruined, their lives have been ruined by social media. To the child, says Miss Edel, I am so sorry that you're even dealing with this, the girl who had been selling water. I would never want to crush anyone's entrepreneurial spirit. That doesn't really sound like much of an apology. I'm so sorry you're dealing with this, not I'm so sorry that I did this to you. I'd like to say I'm sorry to the mother and how I actually interacted with her, because I know I escalated it too. Right, the implication there being that it wasn't just her fault, right? So she's willing to take some blame and responsibility, but not all of it. And in the case of Miss Cooper, I'm not a racist, right? We hear this, I think, often in these cases. I did not mean to harm that man in any way. She's not even using Mr. Cooper's name. She's just that man, which I think is indicative here, right? Indicative of the fact that Mr. Cooper, for her, seemed to fill in this stereotypical role of a black man, and that she would wield it in that way. We saw that. We saw it so much in the video. My entire life is being destroyed. So I think that we're at a point of reckoning here, and one in which history can provide a critical lens on issues like this. Let's return to Frankenberg, who theorized about whiteness. She says, to look at the social construction of whiteness is to look head-on at a site of dominance. To speak of white is to assign everyone a place in the relations of racism, right? That everybody has a place. It's not as simple as Cooper says about saying, I'm not racist, or, yeah, I did a racist thing. It's not even that simple. It's dealing and understanding with the ways in which whiteness works in American society and how everybody with white skin should have some understanding of that. Certainly black Americans already have an understanding of that and live with it every day. It is to emphasize that dealing with racism is not merely an option. It's not an option for white people. That rather racism shapes white people's lives and identities in a way that is inseparable from other facets of daily life. And so I think what we can take from that understanding is a more deep sense of how race and privilege works in our society and how it has worked historically, so that when these moments do happen, we can see them as the end or the last, simply the last point in the culmination of a long arc of history that has seen the wielding of white power and female white power in this case in ways that have affected African American community and black men in particular in ways that are damaging and discriminatory and in fact deadly. So this just scrapes the surface, I think, and certainly for more information about these issues, I would put forth a number of different sources here in the bibliography. You can take a look at them. Some of them are available via ebook from Southern's library, and so you can begin to read about this stuff in a more deep and historical way, which I hope you will. Thank you, and hope to see you next week for another installment of these history lecture teach-ins.